Every empire had its libraries. But when Africa is burned, the world forgot what was lost. Before Alexandria, before Oxford, there was Timbuktu, Axum, Kush. This is the story of Africa's erased books and the wisdom that refused to die. When we imagine the great libraries of the ancient world, we are told of marble halls and scrolls bathed in Mediterranean light. Yet, long before those marble walls were built, Africa's own archives were already alive, written on papyrus, etched into stone, and recited beneath the stars. In the temples of Kemet, scribes filled shelves with scrolls on medicine, astronomy, mathematics, and spiritual law. In Kush and Meroe, libraries housed writings in the Meroitic script, still partly undeciphered, whispers from a time when Africa not only shaped the world, but also recorded it. Further east, in Axum, monks preserved sacred codices written in Ge'ez, their hands guided by both ink and prayer. These were not myths. They were archives of our continent's intellect, vast, methodical, and deeply human. But then came the fire, not one flame, but many, slow, deliberate, and devastating. The fires of invasion, the fires of colonialism, the fires of silence that followed when historians turned away. Scrolls were burned, manuscripts stolen, temples plundered, and oral knowledge dismissed as superstition. What survived was not the whole story, but fragments. Charred pieces of brilliance buried beneath centuries of distortion. The silence that followed was not natural. It was constructed, layered by those who feared the truth of Africa's written past. That this continent was never without libraries, and that its scholars were never without pen or purpose. And yet, the wisdom did not die. In secret rooms and desert vaults, families hid manuscripts beneath the sand. In Ethiopian monasteries carved into mountain stone, monks guarded ancient codices through war and empire. Griots carried genealogies in memory, their voices becoming the living pages of an unwritten library. Through every conquest, the guardians of knowledge adapted, disguised, and endured. This is their story. The story of those who refused to let the fire have the final word. Because the libraries may have burned, but the knowledge remains. Hidden, whispering, waiting to be read again. Ancient Egypt, Nubia, and Axum. These weren't myths. They were archives of medicine, mathematics, and cosmology. Long before the printing press and parchment scrolls in medieval Europe, the African continent had already developed highly structured systems of writing, record-keeping, and literary production. From the sun-washed banks of the Nile to the rocky highlands of Ethiopia, Africa housed libraries and intellectual traditions that predated and often rivaled those of the so-called classical world. This wasn't a continent waiting for civilization to arrive. It was already producing manuscripts, documenting philosophies, and preserving knowledge in both sacred and scholarly spaces. In ancient Egypt, known to its people as Kemet, the scribal tradition was both a spiritual vocation and a pillar of governance. To become a scribe was to be trained in a rigorous intellectual lineage, learning not only how to write hieroglyphs hieratic, and later demotic script, but also to master literature, mathematics, engineering, law, and astronomy. The House of Life, per Ankh, was more than a library. It was a living institution, a scriptorium and university combined, attached to major temples like those in Memphis and Thebes. These were places where sacred texts were copied and archived, where scholars debated cosmic principles, and where records of medical procedures and engineering plans were preserved. The temples themselves were designed with geometrical precision that aligned with astronomical principles, informed by text stored within their own walls. Kemet's legacy wasn't just carved into pyramids or inscribed on tomb walls. It was preserved in scrolls and codices, many of which were destroyed or lost in the successive waves of conquest. Yet fragments survive, revealing detailed knowledge of anatomy, pharmacology, algebraic equations, and an intricate calendar based on solar and stellar cycles. These weren't superstitions. These were empirical observations, organized, taught, and passed down for centuries. Much of what later appeared in Greco-Roman science and philosophy owes its origin to these earlier African texts. Just south of Egypt, the kingdom of Kush continued and expanded this literary and spiritual tradition. Centered in what is now northern Sudan, Kush was more than just Egypt's southern neighbor. It was a sovereign civilization with its own script, Meroitic, and its own libraries. While much of Meroitic writing remains undeciphered, the fact that a unique written language was in widespread use across temples, administrative centers, and monuments is evidence of a literate society steeped in both statecraft and spirituality. The temple complex at Gebel Barkal served as both a religious center and a repository of sacred knowledge. Here, priest scribes recorded ritual instructions, calendrical data, and royal decrees. While the loss of the Meroitic key has delayed our full understanding of their intellectual traditions, the sheer volume of inscriptions and texts points to a sophisticated archival culture. Further east, in the highlands of Ethiopia, a different but equally profound literary tradition was forming. The kingdom of Axum, one of the greatest empires of late antiquity, developed its own script, Ge'ez, and used it to record a wealth of spiritual, historical, and philosophical texts. Christianity reached Axum in the 4th century, but it was not imposed. It was adapted, rooted in pre-existing African cosmologies, and preserved in manuscripts that would survive far longer than many Western equivalents. Ethiopian scribes, working by candlelight in mountain monasteries, copied texts by hand for over 1,000 years. Their libraries included biblical texts, apocryphal gospels, ancient medical treatises, astrological charts, and chronicles of kings. These manuscripts weren't stored in massive state-run libraries, but in monastic networks that dotted the Ethiopian highlands. Each church or monastery functioned like a node in a greater intellectual web, some hidden in caves, others perched on cliff edges. The Church of Debre Damo, accessible only by rope, still houses centuries-old scrolls and books that have never been fully catalogued. The monks who protected them weren't just guardians of faith. They were librarians, philosophers, and historians. To this day, some of these texts remain untranslated, written in an archaic Ge'ez script that requires years of study to interpret. This is the part of Africa's literary legacy that challenges every stereotype. These weren't oral cultures waiting to be written. They were highly literate civilizations with their own texts, their own epistemologies, and their own systems of classification and critique. Their writings covered everything from medicine to metaphysics, not preserved in glass cases or museums, but often buried beneath stone, hidden in hills, or locked away in wooden chests protected by generations of spiritual guardians. So why are they so little known? Why does the world memorize the names of Plato and Galen, but forget the scribes of Memphis, the priests of Meroe, or the monks of Axum? The answer is not in the content of these texts, which is vast and powerful, but in the politics of historical memory. Colonial systems of education were not designed to honor African intellect. They were designed to replace it. And so, the libraries of Africa were not only lost through war and time, they were deliberately erased from the global imagination. Yet the truth remains. Long before the Renaissance, long before Gutenberg's press, and long before the Enlightenment, African hands had already written, preserved, and contemplated the mysteries of life, the universe, and the human body. These weren't myths. They were archives of medicine, mathematics, and cosmology. They are not gone. They are just waiting to be remembered. Timbuktu, the city of 700,000 manuscripts. While Europe fought in the Dark Ages, Timbuktu's classrooms discussed the stars. In the Western imagination, Timbuktu is often evoked as a faraway myth, a metaphor for the ends of the earth. But this perception is no accident. It's a smokescreen. For centuries, the real Timbuktu was not an abstraction. It was a center of learning so vast, so luminous, that it once rivaled any intellectual capital on earth. In the heart of the Malian Empire during its golden age, between the 13th and 16th centuries, Timbuktu stood as a beacon of scholarship, philosophy, and scientific inquiry. Its libraries, filled with hundreds of thousands of manuscripts, told a different story of Africa, not of darkness, but of brilliance. The city's intellectual foundation was built on three legendary institutions: the universities of Sankore, Jingaraibe, and Sidi Yahya. These were not merely places of religious instruction. They were full-fledged centers of higher learning, attracting scholars, poets, scientists, and jurists from across the Islamic world. The University of Sankore in particular operated with a curriculum and structure comparable to any modern university. Students studied under learned masters, moving from basic instruction to complex debates and independent research. Diplomas were awarded based on years of study and demonstrated mastery, not arbitrary timelines. Within these institutions were libraries that held a staggering wealth of knowledge, not hundreds, not thousands, but reportedly up to 700,000 manuscripts. These texts covered a dizzying array of subjects: astronomy, law, philosophy, medicine, mathematics, optics, agriculture, ethics, music, and more. Written in Arabic, Fulani, Songhai, and Ajami, African languages written in Arabic script, these manuscripts were not foreign imports. They were often authored by West African scholars themselves. The pages revealed an Africa engaged in global intellectual currents, adapting and innovating its own ideas. While much of Europe wrestled with feudal chaos and religious intolerance, Timbuktu scholars were mapping stars, documenting surgical procedures, discussing political theory, and debating the ethics of trade and governance. Astronomy was not a novelty. It was serious science, used to create calendars, navigation systems, and align religious rituals with cosmic patterns. Legal theory was studied in depth, with jurists comparing interpretations from North Africa, Persia, and the Maghreb. Timbuktu scholars produced commentary, critiques, and original works that formed part of a living intellectual tradition. Among the city's most renowned thinkers was Ahmed Baba, born in 1556. Often referred to as the last great scholar of Timbuktu, Ahmed Baba authored over 40 books in law, theology, grammar, and history. His scholarship was so widely respected that even after his exile to Morocco during the Saadian invasion, Moroccan scholars were ordered to treat him with reverence. He openly criticized the Moroccan occupation and refused to accept that African scholarship was subordinate to Arab or European models. His surviving writings continue to be studied today, revealing a sharp analytical mind deeply committed to justice, literacy, and the preservation of African intellectual sovereignty. Another key figure was Abu Ishaq al-Sahili, an Andalusian scholar and architect who journeyed to Mali during the reign of Mansa Musa. While often credited with introducing Islamic architecture to West Africa, al-Sahili's real contribution was the synthesis, not the import of knowledge. He worked alongside Malian scholars, helping shape the city's infrastructure, both physical and intellectual. Under Mansa Musa, who famously distributed so much gold during his pilgrimage to Mecca that he disrupted entire economies, Timbuktu's intellectual institutions were elevated and generously supported. Musa's wealth was not hoarded, it was invested in minds, in manuscripts, in monuments. The libraries themselves were community treasures. They weren't state-controlled archives, but private and family-run collections, often passed down through generations. Scholars took pride in preserving books, copying them by hand, and annotating them with marginalia that added layers of thought over the centuries. Some families, to this day, continue to guard these collections in hidden compartments, caves, and mud brick homes. These manuscripts were not only sacred, they were seen as living companions, guides for both the spiritual and the temporal world. And yet, how many history books tell this story? How many students learn that West Africa once led the world in manuscript preservation? That an African city was once a literary superpower? The narrative of African illiteracy was constructed. While Europe fought in the Dark Ages, Timbuktu's classrooms discussed the stars. Today, scholars, archivists, and digital preservation teams are racing against time to save what remains. Climate change, political instability, and theft threaten these ancient texts. But every manuscript saved is a page restored to the African timeline. It is a reminder that Africa was never without writing, never without knowledge, and certainly never without libraries. Timbuktu was not a myth. It was a miracle of human thought, and it still is. The other libraries they never told you about. Africa's libraries spoke in ink, rhythm, and geometry. When we hear the word library, we often picture shelves of books, scrolls, or manuscripts, a physical archive of ink on paper. But Africa's libraries went beyond parchment. They existed not only in books, but in breath, in beats, in bronze. They were encoded in temple walls, preserved in verses passed mouth to mouth for centuries, and even sculpted into the architecture of sacred space. These were systems of knowledge as rigorous as any written tradition, only harder to erase because they lived inside people, music, and ritual. Let us begin again with Nubia, not in the better-known days of Kush and Meroe, but specifically at Jebel Barkal, the mountain long considered the spiritual and political heart of Nubian kingship. Located near the Nile in what is now northern Sudan, Jebel Barkal wasn't just a religious sanctuary, it was an intellectual one. The temple archives here held records written in Meroitic script, inscribed on stone stelae and temple walls. Though still largely undeciphered, these inscriptions reflect a society engaged in preserving theological, historical, and astronomical knowledge. The temples at Jebel Barkal were laid out with astonishing architectural precision, aligned with celestial phenomena, not as ornamentation, but as a coded cosmology. Every column, every chamber, was part of a sacred language, a library in stone, telling time through geometry. Now shift westward into the forested heart of what is now Nigeria, where the Yoruba people created one of the world's most intricate oral knowledge systems, Ifa. Ifa is more than religion. It is a vast philosophical system containing tens of thousands of verses called Odu, each encoded with parables, historical memory, ethics, cosmology, and medicine. These verses are memorized, preserved, and transmitted by babalawos, priest diviners trained for years to recite, interpret, and apply the wisdom of Ifa. In practice, Ifa functions exactly like a library. Ask a question, and the babalawo searches through the Odu to find your answer, not with an index, but with ritual and memory. Each consultation draws from a database of oral text larger than most European medieval libraries. And it's still alive today, evolving and spoken, passed from mind to mind like a sacred archive written on the soul. In Central Africa, the Congo Kingdom developed yet another form of encoded knowledge, this time in cosmological diagrams, proverbs, and symbolic text known as Nzila. Nzila, meaning path in Kikongo, represents a system of moral and spiritual navigation, a map of the soul's journey through life, death, and rebirth. While many of these teachings were passed orally, they were also embedded into the art, the layout of villages, and the iconography of sacred objects. The Dikenga cosmogram, for instance, a circular diagram representing the four moments of the sun and stages of life, was not merely symbolic. It was a blueprint for education, ritual timing, and community organization. Elders served as librarians of this knowledge, transmitting it through dance, parable, and initiation ceremonies. The Congo worldview was a library of symbols, designed not to be read with eyes, but with understanding. And then, once more, we return to Ethiopia, whose legacy of literary preservation stretches even beyond Axum. In the highlands, nestled in the shadows of jagged peaks and carved monoliths, monasteries from the 15th century and earlier still hold illuminated manuscripts, painted and written by hand in the ancient Ge'ez language. These are not just religious documents. They include medical texts, apocalyptic literature, magic scrolls, and codices on the movement of stars. They are beautifully illustrated with color-rich iconography that survived the elements and centuries of war. These monasteries, some reachable only by rope or ladder, served as both spiritual sanctuaries and de facto libraries. The monks who lived there were not merely ascetics. They were scholars, calligraphers, and historians. Each manuscript was copied by hand, often over years, using natural inks and hides. These texts were not public, and many remain untranslated to this day. They wait in the cool shadows of stone churches, guarded by priests who understand their weight, not just as paper, but as memory. What ties these diverse traditions together? from Nubian stone inscriptions to Yoruba oral texts, from Congo cosmograms to Ethiopian codices, is the unmistakable presence of a library culture that defied definition. Africa's libraries didn't all look like buildings. Some danced, some sang, some whispered in divination rooms or thundered in masked ceremonies. They survived not because they were always written down, but because they were lived, embodied, and constantly renewed. And yet, these forms of knowledge were often excluded from the word literature by colonial historians and Western academics. Why? Because they didn't come bound in leather or stored in cathedrals? Because they didn't use Latin or Greek? The truth is simpler and harder. Africa's libraries were never lost. They were just never acknowledged. Africa's libraries spoke in ink, rhythm, and geometry. They are not remnants of a past. They are systems that still pulse today. They remind us that knowledge isn't always about how we store it. It's about how we live it. To conquer knowledge, they first had to silence it. By the time European powers arrived on African shores with ships, swords, and Bibles, Africa had already built temples of thought. Its books had been written, copied, hidden, and revered. Its philosophies had been passed down in verse and ink. Its archives, though diverse in form, were intact. But if power is built on the control of memory, then Africa's intellectual traditions posed a threat to colonial ambitions. So they were targeted, not just with brute force, but with the cold precision of erasure. The invasion wasn't always waged on the battlefield. It was waged in libraries, in schools, in rituals interrupted, and records destroyed. In Timbuktu, one of the world's greatest centers of learning, thousands of manuscripts were burned or stolen during the Moroccan invasion of 1591. Soldiers looted homes, universities, and mosques. Scribes were forced into hiding. Some families buried their collections in desert sand, risking everything to preserve what centuries had built. Later, during the French colonial period, entire libraries were confiscated or dismissed as irrelevant folklore. Rare astronomical treatises, theological works, and legal commentaries were carted off to Europe, stripped of context, orphaned from the culture that created them. The city of Axum, once the jewel of Ethiopian Christianity and a guardian of ancient Ge'ez manuscripts, suffered a similar fate. As European contact increased and missionaries arrived, the very texts that had sustained Ethiopian faith for centuries were declared unorthodox. Doctrines deemed incompatible with European interpretations of Christianity were either replaced or destroyed. Missionaries came not only with scripture, but with fire. In many places they banned what they could not understand: apocryphal gospels, herbal medicine texts, and spiritual commentaries, branding them heretical, pagan, or simply uncivilized. What they left behind was not just scorched parchment, but a scorched lineage. And then there was Benin. In 1897, during the British punitive expedition, the Kingdom of Benin was violently sacked. Its sacred bronzes, ivory carvings, and royal archives were looted. Hundreds of cultural artifacts shipped off to the British Museum and European private collections. While much attention has been given to the stolen bronzes, few speak of the palm leaf manuscripts and ritual texts that vanished. These texts recorded laws, histories, and spiritual protocols, the very software of Benin's sophisticated governance and priesthood systems. In their absence, colonial authorities declared the kingdom illiterate, rewriting its story as one of savagery instead of sovereignty. The theft wasn't always physical. In many parts of Africa, missionaries and colonial administrators actively worked to replace indigenous knowledge systems with colonial versions. In schools, children were forbidden to speak their mother tongues. Oral traditions were ridiculed as myth. Spiritual practices were demonized. Libraries when built, contained only European texts. Education was weaponized to produce obedience, not enlightenment. Generations grew up without access to their own intellectual inheritance. To conquer land was one thing, but to conquer memory, that was the real victory. Today, thousands of African manuscripts in Arabic, Ge'ez, Ajami, and indigenous scripts sit in the archives of Oxford, Paris, Berlin, and Rome. Catalogued in European libraries, many remain untranslated, misclassified, or ignored. They are seen as curiosities, not as contributions to the global canon. And still, efforts to return them are met with resistance. Requests for repatriation are often dismissed with bureaucratic shrugs or academic red tape. But make no mistake, these texts were not donated. They were stolen. And so, for every destroyed manuscript, there was also a silenced voice. For every burned library, a lineage disrupted. Africa's intellectual landscape wasn't just forgotten, it was forcefully erased. Because to conquer knowledge, they first had to silence it. And for a time, they did. But silence is never permanent. Memory always finds a way back. The books they tried to erase are speaking again, through us. In every age of destruction, there are protectors. Guardians who defy silence, who hide knowledge beneath floorboards or in caves, who carry the sacred in their hands and refuse to let it vanish. Though Africa's libraries were looted, burned and erased from the record, not all was lost. The wisdom endured, scattered, hidden, whispered, waiting for its moment to rise again. In the sands of Mali, that moment has already begun. During the violent insurgencies of the 2010s in Timbuktu, when extremist forces swept through the region, scholars, librarians, and ordinary citizens risked their lives to save manuscripts. Families who had preserved ancient texts for generations, some dating back over 800 years, quietly moved thousands of handwritten books out of harm's way. In cloth sacks, suitcases, and crates, they smuggled manuscripts across the desert under cover of night. These weren't just books. They were ancestral voices, repositories of science, philosophy, and spiritual lore, the legacy of empires that once lit the African sky. Some families buried their collections in basements. Others tucked them behind false walls. And when the fire came, what they protected didn't burn. What the world saw as fragile pages, these communities saw as a sacred inheritance. Their devotion preserved over 350,000 manuscripts, a stunning testament to Mali's intellectual heritage and to the courage of everyday people who refused to let memory die. Far from the desert, in the green highlands of Ethiopia, another miracle of survival continues to unfold. In stone-carved monasteries older than many nations, monks are still translating Ge'ez manuscripts, many by candlelight, using the same hand-copying traditions that have existed for over 1,000 years. These texts include biblical scriptures, theological commentaries, herbal medical guides, and cosmological treatises, passed down through war, empire, and modern pressures. They have never stopped being read, studied, and revered. In places like Debre Libanos and Dabunagarima, the pages are more than relics. They are living tools of faith and identity. Some of these manuscripts contain diagrams, lunar calendars, and coded messages whose meanings are only fully understood by the initiated. They are sacred, yes, but they are also deeply intellectual. Ethiopia's monks have been quietly keeping a literary tradition alive while the world looked elsewhere. And now, in the digital age, a new generation is stepping in to continue the work. Across Africa, scholars, coders, and cultural activists are launching digital restoration projects aimed at preserving these ancient texts for future generations. Organizations like Savama DCI and the Hill Museum and Manuscript Library are working with local communities to scan, catalog, and translate thousands of manuscripts from Mali, Ethiopia, and beyond. What was once fragile is now being made durable. Backed up in digital archives, accessible to scholars and students around the world. This is not just preservation. It is repatriation through technology, a way of returning Africa's intellectual property to its rightful place, the minds and hands of its people. Young Africans are reclaiming what was nearly lost. They are learning Ge'ez and Ajami, studying Ifa, digitizing scrolls, and building platforms that recenter African voices in global scholarship. These are the librarians of the future, not guardians of silence, but storytellers of resurgence. Every text scanned, every verse remembered, every archive restored is a small revolution against centuries of erasure. And in that quiet revolution, the books are speaking again, not just through ink, but through action, through breath, through code, through resistance. They are speaking through us. Because when you try to erase a people's story, you only make it harder to forget. When you bury knowledge, it doesn't die. It waits. And now, across libraries both ancient and digital, the voices that colonialism tried to silence are rising again. The books they tried to erase are speaking again, through us. The true wealth of Africa was never gold. It was wisdom. And now, that wisdom is rising from the ashes. Africa's story has never been a story of absence. It has been a story of interruption. Not a lack of greatness, but a theft of memory. For centuries, this continent wrote, preserved, studied, and debated in temples, in cities, in caves, in courtyards. Its intellectuals documented the stars while others battled superstition. Its healers recorded remedies while others feared disease. Its philosophers asked questions that echoed across civilizations. But those stories were silenced, not because they lacked value, but because they held too much of it. And yet, memory cannot be buried forever. It finds ways to breathe through hidden texts, oral lineages, sacred traditions, and the relentless courage of those who refuse to forget. Today, that memory is returning. In classrooms across Africa, students are learning about Timbuktu, not as myth, but as fact. They are discovering that their ancestors didn't just resist, they reasoned. They theorized, they wrote, they taught. The myth of Africa's silence is collapsing under the weight of evidence that was always there, waiting, in manuscripts, in songs, in symbols. The return of memory is not just academic. It is emotional. It is spiritual. To reclaim these libraries is to reclaim our right to define ourselves, to tell our own stories, to value our own ways of knowing. It is an act of resistance against the global system that once decided who was worth remembering. It is also an act of love. Love for the ancestors who wrote in the margins, who memorized every word, who carved meaning into stone, who passed knowledge from hand to hand, even when it was forbidden. And it's happening now, not only in archives and universities, but on phones, in podcasts, in social media threads, in digital libraries. The voices are no longer hidden in vaults. They are being shared, quoted, translated, and reimagined. Young Africans are not only reclaiming this wisdom, they are expanding it, building upon it, teaching it in new languages and in new formats. The return of memory is not just about restoration, it's about reinvention. It's about honoring the past not by freezing it, but by letting it move, evolve, and inspire. Because the true wealth of Africa was never just its gold. Gold attracted invaders. Wisdom sustained nations. It created healers and astronomers, poets and judges, builders and priests. It taught how to live in balance with the land, how to treat the sick, how to understand the stars. That is the wealth we are returning to now, not because someone gave it back, but because we never stopped holding it. We just stopped being told it was real. The libraries of Africa were never lost. They were stolen, hidden, ignored. But they are not silent. They are speaking through our mouths, our screens, our studies. Every rediscovered manuscript, every remembered proverb, every digitized scroll is a line in a new story, a story of return. And now, that return belongs to all of us. If this truth opened your mind, don't let it end here. Like this video to honor those who hid the manuscripts beneath their floors. Comment to share what your ancestors passed down. A story, a proverb, a question. And subscribe to History Store. Because together, we are helping to rewrite the world's oldest library. The fire may have burned the pages, but the wisdom survived. And now, it's rising.